make sure I record this time, and that way if anybody misses anything, I'll try to have some recordings of this set up at some point that you can access, if that would be helpful. Let's begin. I'm going to start us on our chart here. Hopefully you guys can see this. All right. Let me fix my screen. All right, can everybody see the chart there?
Yes.
Does everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, last week we spent a lot of time on those first 3 steps to focus our attention on the book as a whole, right? So for any passage, we want to understand the book as a whole. So that was where we emphasized most of our attention, and then we began to talk about the poetic analysis a little bit on our 4th step. And for that 4th step, the poetic analysis, let's remember the first 2 steps that we've covered so far is, now that, once you, for a psalm, for example, there is no book level study, so we're going to focus in specifically on the passage. And remember, each psalm has its own background and setting. So if we want to study a particular psalm, we just dive right into the passage and begin to read and make observations. So we did that last week, spent a lot of time on that. And then following that step, we spent some time looking at the setting of the poem. That's the next step. First, read in several translations, read over and over. And as I suggested last week, if it's a small enough psalm, go ahead and start memorizing it. I found that to be very helpful. Once you've done that, you're now ready to first examine the setting of the psalm. Now, when I say setting, what do I mean by that? The setting. Jason, if I were to mention the setting of a psalm, what would that mean? What would that entail? What am I talking about?
The author.
Yeah, the background, the author, the location, the time it was written.
Yeah, excellent. It's the author. Who is he writing to? The recipients. The occasion for the psalm. Do we know what prompted the psalm? Was there a certain event that created it, or was it written for a certain type of event? Was the psalmist going through a particular struggle, or did something good happen to the person writing it? So, and then also too, we're looking for what places are mentioned. Are there other people mentioned in the psalm? Okay, that's the background context that we talked about last week. So, for example, if we look at second here, Psalm 99, we spent quite a bit of time looking at these various things. If you remember, for this psalm, and it might be helpful for you guys to have your Bible next to you, open to Psalm 99 if you can, or if you're able to do that, because I want to quickly review a couple of things to get us back into that psalm, and then we'll continue further in the analysis. Yeah.
What version are we using?
I've been using the New American Standard,
Okay.
but which one do you have?
ESV.
Yeah, that's pretty close.
Similar? Okay.
Yeah, I compared the translations. The ESV is very similar.
Yeah, thanks.
I think only one line and one verse is a little bit different, so
okay.
Should be okay.
Thanks.
I'll pull up the psalm when I can for you guys, but all right. So try to have that open next to you, and the ESV version should be okay. It'll be pretty close. Okay. Now, the background context. Again, as we talked about, do we know who the author is? Did the psalmist mention that?
No.
We don't, right? We
No.
weren't given that information in this psalm. There wasn't a title, so the author's unknown. But again, we do know a little bit from the author, from his tone, right? From this psalm in particular. In fact, why don't we do this? Let's just go back and read the psalm one more time together. I think that would be helpful to do. Let me see. Do I have it on this? Let's do this. Pull up. Sorry, man. Give me one. Okay, here we go. Let me cut and paste it. I think this will help. Okay. Okay. Let's go ahead and read this. Charlie, is your audio working okay? Can you read? It's not working? Okay. Kenneth, can you read the first 3 verses?
Okay, okay, Pastor Tim.
And then Joshua, verses 4 to 6. And then
Okay,
Brother Jess, read 7 through 9. All right?
Yes, Pastor Tim.
Okay, Kenneth, go ahead.
The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He is enthroned above the cherubim. Let the earth shake. The Lord is great in Zion, and he is exalted above all the peoples. Let them praise your great name. Great and awesome name. Holy is he.
the strength of the king loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Holy is he. Moses and Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called upon the Lord, and he answered them.
In the pillar of the cloud, he spoke to them. They kept his testimonies and the statutes that he gave them. O Lord, our God, you answer them. You were a forgiving God to them, but an avenger of their wrongdoing. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy mountain, for the Lord our God is holy.
Okay, very good. So you're reading out of ESV there, but notice it was very similar. All right, so we don't see a title to this psalm, correct? So we aren't told who the author is explicitly, but what would you say about the author? What was his tone here? Is this psalm a lament, a prayer, or is this psalm what's the tone?
A psalm of praise and exaltation.
Praise,
An a call to worship.
call to worship. Yeah, I would say
In honor of our holy God.
yeah, praise. He's enthusiastic, right? Okay. Now, and then the recipients we discussed briefly is speaking. He's talking. He mentions Moses and Samuel and Aaron. He talks about worshiping at his holy hill, which is a reference to temple, right? So he's speaking primarily to whom here?
Israel.
The people of
Israel.
Israel, right? Particularly,
During Kingdom period.
yeah, those going to worship. Okay.
The pilgrim.
How about we talked a little bit also last week about when might this psalm have been written, and we just discussed, maybe the earliest and the latest that it could have been written. You guys remember that discussion? What was the likely window when was the earliest the psalm could have been written?
During the
Sir
time of
Samuel.
the destruction.
Solomon.
Okay, when is the earliest?
Solomon's time.
Yeah, during maybe Solomon's time. And the earliest?
How about David?
Because remember, he mentions there's a temple, right? So the temple wasn't built until Solomon Solomon built it. When is the latest that it could have been written?
Before the exile.
Before the exile. Why is that?
The
Because
temple is still there.
Yeah.
Yeah, the temple is still there, and the ark is still there.
Yeah.
Okay, because if we go back and look, remember he talks about in verse 1 here, he is enthroned above the cherubim. That's likely a reference to the picture of the ark in the Holy of Holies. So if you remember, you know, the ark had the cherubim, the angels with the wings, and they touched each other across the top of the ark, and in between them was the mercy seat where God would essentially express himself at times. And so the picture there is likely speaking of the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant. Okay? So last week, we spent a lot of time on this step because what I wanted you to see was just if you really spend a lot of time and make observations, there's many details within these poems that give us a lot of insight. And many times we can figure out generally, you know, even if we don't know the exact author and he doesn't tell us the exact event that caused him to write, we can still get a lot of information within the psalm about those things. And so I just wanted you last week to see that if you spend a lot of time and are careful, make a lot of observations, there are many clues within the poems that help us with this information. And so if we go back to when it was written, that likely it's either from Solomon's time up until before the exile. So we know from you know, Bible encyclopedias and stuff, that would be roughly, say, the mid 900s BC up to around 600 BC, somewhere in there. Okay. Again, it's not important that we know exactly, but this is helpful to kind of tell us, okay, this is not a poem that was written after the exile, nor was it a poem written before the time of David. So it gives us a little bit of an idea of the time in Israel's history here. This is before the nation is taken into captivity, and it's basically during the time of the kings, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So when it was written. Now, do we have, there were a couple places mentioned, the geographical context. Did you guys, what places are mentioned here? Are there any cities or nations mentioned?
Zion.
Holy
Hill.
Zion and Holy Hill, right? Okay, good. Those are, Zion is a reference, either, it could be a reference to one of three things. Either the city of Jerusalem as a whole, or the Temple Mount, or the temple itself. If you look in the Old Testament and look up all the references to Zion, you'll see those three. The most common reference, if I remember, is the Temple Mount, is a reference to the temple itself. But it's either Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, or the temple. So we have Zion, and then also we have Holy Hill, and that is a reference to the Temple Mount. Okay. Okay, that's good. Now we also looked at, there are some people mentioned here in the Psalm, some specific people.
Moses.
Okay. Moses,
Aaron,
Jacob.
Aaron,
Samuel,
and Samuel, and also good, Jacob is mentioned,
Jacob.
right?
yeah,
Okay, and it's helpful to know about these men for a couple of reasons. One is it tells us who the primary audience is, right? He's speaking to the Jews specifically. But then also, what do we know about these men? Are they remote, very unknown, or are they well known?
Prominent.
Very prominent, right?
Yeah.
In fact, they would be among the top 10. Moses certainly is the greatest prophet before John the Baptist. Aaron was the first high priest. Samuel, of course, was a prophet, and he was the first a prophet. God had been silent for many decades until Samuel came. He was the last judge, and he ushered in the time of the kings. He's the link between the judges and the kings. So Samuel's very important. And then, of course, Jacob, he is the father of the nation of Israel. Okay? So one thing to keep in our minds as we're studying the psalm is, why are these particular men mentioned? Why not Abraham? Why not David? Why not, some other well-known individual? Why these men? Okay, we don't have to answer that right now, but it's just we need to pay attention and take note of it. Okay, and then the occasion, and that is, and let me remind you guys, the difference between the occasion and the purpose. Okay, the occasion is what prompted the author to write. Okay, what situation or thought or circumstance or event prompted the author to write. What was it that caused him to sit down and write this poem? Okay, now certainly we could say the Holy Spirit. Obviously he is the key individual involved, but usually there was some sort of event or situation or thought or idea on the heart of the author that caused him to do this, okay, to write it. Now the purpose, can somebody answer for me? What is the difference? What is the purpose of this poem, or a purpose of a poem or a writing? How is it different than the occasion? Does anybody want to try to answer that?
But then I think the purpose is the intent that the author is trying to accomplish, that is triggered by a certain occasion that happened.
Okay, good. Anyone else want to add to that? The difference between the purpose of a biblical writing and the occasion for it. I think Brother Jess captured it well. No one wants to add more to what you said, Brother Jess. You're the scholar here. Yeah, I think he's exactly right. The purpose is the intent of the author, what he wanted to communicate, what was the theme or the point of his writing. The occasion is just what caused him or prompted him to write. Okay? And this will be true for epistles, for narratives, for every book of the Bible. There's always something that prompts the author to write, and then there is a theme or a focus or an intent in what he's writing, what he wants to communicate in that writing. Okay, so we could say what the author wants to communicate, or we could call it the theme of the writing, in this case the poem. So here we have, in this particular situation, the occasion for this poem. What do you think it is? What do you think the occasion, or what prompted the author to write? Any ideas? What was on his mind, you think?
Worship.
Worship, right?
Yeah.
We'll call it temple worship specifically. Okay.
Pastor Ted.
Yes.
So, brother, this is one. Wait. Brother Charlie Garcia has just wrote in a group chat here in Zoom
Oh,
about
okay.
Samuel 6, verse 12 to 17. It might be the occasion, it can be, I don't know. But I just look at it and maybe somehow, because this is the time where David, no, got the Ark of the Covenant and is bringing it in the city of David.
So the
Sure.
temple is not yet.
Can be the occasion, it can be. I think somehow,
During the time, the temple is not yet built.
yeah, but he's bringing it to the city of David.
Yeah, he is. The
Covenant.
temple's not built,
Yeah.
but there is an ark.
Yeah,
And
there's an ark, and they were actually praising God for the return of God, the ark.
yeah, it's possible. In fact, it's actually very interesting if you compare Psalm 96 and Psalm 98 to what's written at the time when David was bringing the ark to Jerusalem. There's a lot of overlap. There's, in fact, if I remember, let me look this up for a moment here. If I can find it. Oh, give me a second. If you look up, what did you say, 1 Samuel 6?
Second, Pastor Tim.
Oh, yeah, okay, second,
This
thank
is
you.
from Charlie Garcia, Brad Pastor Charlie. He's writing it in the chat, so I just look it up and find it interesting.
Yeah, if you look at 2 Samuel, or I was thinking of 1 Chronicles. Chapter 16. David offers a psalm of thanksgiving when they brought the ark into Jerusalem. And if you compare that psalm in 1 Samuel 16 with the Psalms of 96 and 98, you see a lot of similar statements. So it is very possible that Psalm 99, which was grouped together with Psalm 96, 97, and 98, perhaps the person who organized the Psalms had the same idea as our brother commentator Charlie, that perhaps the Psalm 99 was also prompted by what Psalm 96 and Psalm 98, the same occasion. So that's a good possibility. I think some scholars would support that. We don't know for sure, but I think that's a good hypothesis, good possibility. You guys following? To make sense? You can do this sometime. Compare 1 Chronicles 16 with, and then read that chapter and David's psalm there, and then compare it to Psalm 96, 98, and you'll find some similarities. Okay, so Psalm 99 may be the same. So that's a very good insight. So I'll even put it down here. We didn't talk about this last time, so that's good. 2 Samuel 6 or 1 Chronicles 16. Compare with Psalm 96, 98. Could this be the occasion? Okay. Very good. Now the purpose, what the author wanted to communicate. What did he want to communicate with this psalm? I mean, what is as we look back at this psalm, and we talked about this last week, what it seems to be the main thrust, the main focus of this psalm?
The people to worship God.
People coming to worship.
Exalt the Holy Lord.
God.
Yeah, exalt God. And notice we have highlighted, holy is He. Holy is the Lord. So we could even have something, as the purpose of this psalm is a call to temple worship to exalt the holiness or exalt the God who is holy, something like that. Okay. Now again, this is early in our study, so we'll refine this as we go further. But this is just what we've seen so far from this psalm. Okay. Are there any questions? Any other thoughts?
Pastor Tim,
Yes.
can the genre of, or I mean, some type be placed under purpose or under occasion? I mean, if you say purpose, maybe the purpose is that the psalmist is want to express his lament instead of putting it under occasion. So which is which?
Yeah, honestly, it could connect to both. Right, a psalm of lament is a general description, and it can, the occasion of the, well, it'd be more probably purpose, I think, as I think about it, because the occasion is just what causes the psalmist to write. So if it's a lament, his purpose is to cry out to the Lord for help or something like that. But the reason that what caused him to write it could have been, you know, he's surrounded by his enemies, or could have been he's hungry, could have been betrayal, could be a confession, a guilt. So that would be the occasion. But then the purpose would be, what is the message he is expressing in the lament? So I would say type of psalm would go more toward purpose. Good question. So in this case, this is an enthronement psalm, so we can just go there. This psalm is enthronement psalm.
The royal psalm?
We could call it a royal psalm. Enthronement is used just because there's an emphasis on being exalted. A royal psalm has the idea of it's just focusing on kingship, but an enthronement psalm focuses on the sovereign rule of the king, so, and King Yahweh specifically. A royal psalm could be a human king or God as king, but the enthronement psalm more has the idea of exaltation of King Yahweh. Let's put it that way, who is sovereign. So, for example, these enthronement psalms often have the phrase in them, Yahweh or the Lord reigns. You'll see something like that. That's why Psalms 96 through 99, they're kind of grouped together, and they're all considered enthronement psalms because they have this idea of Yahweh reigns. It's not just that he is king, but that he is sovereign king over everything. Okay, so there's an emphasis not just on the fact that God is on the throne, but that he's exalted, he's great, he's worthy to be praised on that throne. Okay, does that make sense?
Okay.
Now, some people combine these together in the enthronement psalm, a royal psalm, a messianic psalm. Some people connect these. I tend to see some distinctions. For example, a messianic psalm is talking about a king, but its focus is on a particular king, the Messiah. Whereas an enthronement psalm focuses on Yahweh, God as king. And we know, of course, the Messiah is the Son of God, but there's still in the Psalms a distinct focus, a difference between those two. And then a royal psalm may be more general category for just psalms that are referring to a king. So Psalm 40, is it 7, I think, which refers to King Solomon, if I remember right, or Psalm 48 or 9, somewhere in there. That's a royal psalm, and it's referencing Solomon as king. Okay. Psalm 2 would be considered a royal psalm in general, but actually it's a messianic psalm because it's speaking of the anointed one. Okay, so we would call that one a messianic psalm specifically, not just a royal psalm. Okay. All right. Any other questions or comments? Okay. All right. Again, we're just reviewing sort of what we had covered last week, but it's been a whole week, so I know sometimes we can forget some things. At least I can. And then the next part of this, as we're looking at the this step, again, the first step in poetic analysis is read through the poem several times, make observations. The second step is to identify the setting of the psalm, as well as its type, and also an outline. Can you identify the stanzas? Maybe I can put that as the. And what were some ways that we did that? How can you identify stanzas within a particular psalm? What are some
Change in
clues?
pronouns.
Okay, maybe a change in pronouns. What else?
Or
Translation.
Yeah, we can look at different translations and see what they put. Again, not inspired, but they can be a helpful guide.
The grammar.
Yeah, is there a change in grammar? Meaning type of verb. Is there a change in the type of verbiage? Or there are some psalms where you'll see imperatives, and then an indicative, or some psalms that you'll see there may be very few verbs used, and then you'll see a lot of verbs. There is also a sort of a change in grammar in this psalm, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Anything else? What other kinds of markers are there which might show stanza?
Selah. When there's
Selah.
a Selah.
Remember, that was sort of the dramatic pause. That's its primary function. It appears that it's supposed to be a pause for reflection, but sometimes it can be a stanza marker. One Psalm 46 is one example, and I think Psalm 3 or 4, I can't remember. All right, good. Refrain. Do we see that in this psalm? That's a repeated phrase, like a chorus. Yeah, we have that in this psalm, don't we?
Yeah.
Yes, we have.
3 times, verse 3, verse 5, and verse 9, I believe. Correct? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, verse 9, 5, verse 3. Okay. Another example, again, Psalm 46 shows that. There's a refrain, a repeated phrase at the end of the stanza. And that's often where you will see the refrain, is at the end of the stanza, marking out the end of it. Any other?
How about, would it be
Change in subject.
change in
subject?
Change in subject.
Yeah. Or sometimes a change in speaker.
Yes.
Psalm 2 is a great example of that, where you have the psalmist speak, and then the Father speaks, and then the Son speaks, and then it goes back to the psalmist. So there's it's almost like a dialogue there. We see that in Habakkuk, which is written in poetic form. There's a dialogue, so change in speaker marks out the structure of the poem. Also, anything else comes to mind?
Exclamations.
Yeah, there can be an exclamation, interjection, behold, or oh God, or oh my soul. Sometimes those can mark out separations. There was another one that came to my mind. Inclusio.
Change in subject matter.
Inclusio.
Inclusio, yeah. Inclusio is a repetition of a particular phrase, and doesn't appear to be a refrain because it's not repeated throughout the poem, but only in a certain section. For example, Psalm 128 has that. And then I heard another one, change in
subject matter.
Subject matter. And we see that here in this psalm, don't we? In Psalm 99, the first 3 verses focus on the greatness or the exaltation of God. Verses 4 and 5 focus on God's justice, and then verses 6 through 9 focus on his mercy, his forgiveness. So we see that here as well. So let's I'm sorry, go ahead.
Change in tone.
In tone or mood?
Sometimes,
Like
yeah.
Change in tone.
And this is a little subjective, but it should support what you see. If you mark out some stanzas, it should support that, okay?
Yeah, I observed that a lot of times in Psalm of Lament, Pastor Tim, because the psalmist seems helpless, and then there's an answer or hope, a tone of hope already.
Yes. Yeah, that's in most laments. That's exactly what you see. The content of the lament. Usually you see the lament at the beginning, God help me, and then we'll see the reason for the lament often. I am overwhelmed by my enemy, I'm downtrodden, and then we'll see that flip with the solution, and there's a change in and usually it's marked out by a statement, but as for me, I will, or something like that. And then the focus turns towards God or his character. That's common in lament. Not every lament has that. For example, Psalm 88, there's no solution. The guy's just crying out. He doesn't have there's no hinge in that lament where he turns toward the hope. So we do see a couple. Psalm 42 is almost like that, where the psalmist questions, why are you in despair, O my soul? Hope in God, for I shall yet praise him. So there is a little bit of hope, but that's all that he says within that particular psalm. And then others have several verses. I would say, a lot of some of these are very strong markers, like a refrain, a very strong marker in the stanza. An inclusio is a very strong marker. Change in subject matter. These are stronger markers than others. Now, as we turn our attention to Psalm 99, sorry. Let's just go here. Let's just do it here. For Psalm 99, let's remind ourselves, what were some of those structural markers, or you guys remember, what are some things that helped us to identify the likely stanzas within this particular psalm?
The refrain.
The refrain's a big one, right? Holy is he, or holy is Yahweh. That's in verses 3, 5, and 9. What else? We talked about this last week. Is there anything else that...
The grammar.
Yeah, you remember that little distinction in the grammar? Remember the last verse of the stanza included a command.
Yeah.
But the earlier verses,
Indicative, imperative.
stanza were statements. Right? So for example, let's go back up to the psalm.
1 to 2 indicative, 3 imperative.
Yeah, you see that? The Lord reigns, statement. Let the peoples tremble. It's really a statement. He is enthroned, statement. The Lord is great, statement. He is exalted, statement. Then verse 3, let them praise, a command. Verse 4 and 5. Verse 4, the strength of the king loves justice, statement. You've established, statement. You've executed justice, a statement. Now verse 5, exalt, command. And the same, verses 6, verse 7, verse 8, these are all in the indicative, meaning they're just making a statement, a fact. But verse 9, exalt. Okay? And then, so we have the grammar, and then finally another strong argument is change in subject matter. right? The verses 1 to 3 focuses on the greatness of God. Verses 4 and 5 focus on the justice or righteousness of God. And then verses 6 through 9 focus on the mercy or forgiveness. Okay? Oops. All right? So actually, the more we look at this, the more I can see a very strong argument for 3 stanzas here in this psalm. And actually, that's the New King James Version has 3 stanzas. Verses 1 to 3, 4 to 5, 6 to 9. Okay? Now, again, this is just early in the process, okay? So as you study more the psalm, as we study together more, there might be some things that come along that tell us, well, maybe the author, it's maybe 2 stanzas or 4 or something like that. So we're not ready to preach this psalm yet, right? So nobody preached this psalm this week, did they? Okay. Hopefully you're laughing because the answer is no,
Yes,
not yes. Okay, so we're just early in the process, but this is what I like. I like to have you think about the outline of the psalm early, just so you're looking for these particular details. All right. Sometimes you'll study a psalm at this point, and it's hard to see the outline. And you may just have question marks. It may not be clear yet. Okay. There are some psalms where that's very difficult. I found that problem with Psalm 51 myself. I had a very hard time seeing a structure there, where, you know, verses 1 to 4 or the first stanza and 5 to 10 or whatever. It seemed like a man who was really just pouring out his heart before God and begging for God to forgive him. But so not every psalm is going to have a clear structure with obvious stanzas. Most do, but just keep in mind some do not necessarily. Okay, especially if you have a short psalm as well, like Psalm 117. It's 2 verses, so you're not going to have 4 stanzas there in that psalm. Okay. Psalm 119, actually, if you look at that psalm, how many stanzas are in that psalm?
22.
22. 1 stanza for each letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's actually an acrostic. If you remember, and you can see this usually in a translation, it'll have the Aleph and then verses 1 through 8, and then it'll say Beth verses 9 to 16, and Gimel verses 17 to 24. And what that means is that the first letter of every verse in that stanza is the same. So for example, verses 1 to 8, every verse, every line in the verse begins with Aleph. And then verses 9 to 16, every verse begins with Beth for all 8 verses. And so the psalmist intentionally does that, and he goes all the way through. Every stanza is, there's 22 of them because there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. All right. And if you tried to break up each of those stanzas further, you can't do it for the most part. Many of them are, those 8 verses are just general statements around one idea. Okay. So it's difficult. So when you preach through that, and I think some of you have a Psalm 119 passage, right? Who has Psalm 119 for your passage? Junie? Anyone else? I can't remember. So you may not have a clear structure in those 8 verses. So you may have a more topical message from that. Okay. Okay. So, any questions? Good. Okay. The reason I'm looking up is I have you guys on a bigger screen above me so I can see everybody. So I know if you're watching or not. Okay. All right. Let's
absorb everything.
All right. So far, these are the 2 steps we've done for our poetic analysis: read and observe, and identify setting and structure. I posted the notes for this last week. Now let's move to the 3rd step in our poetic analysis, and that is where we examine the parallelism used in each verse of the poem. All right, we briefly discussed this last week, brought it up, parallelism. Can somebody tell me what is parallelism in Hebrew poetry? Who can tell me?
It's how the lines in each verse is arranged, or their connection with each other.
Okay, good. How the lines are arranged, how they're connected. I described it in this way. Let me increase the font size here. Okay. Yeah, that word connected is probably a good word to use. Relationship. It's the relationship between the lines. Because again, remember, one feature of Hebrew poetry that's unique to it is it typically presents within each verse 2 or 3 or 4 lines which are all connected to each other. There's a relationship they have with each other in some way. All right. And so as we consider the types, remember what are the different types? What kinds of parallelism do we see in Hebrew poetry? All right. What's the first kind that we see?
Synonymous.
Synonymous.
Synonymous, right? And here's an example. Notice pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before stumbling. So notice the pride,
Haughty spirit.
haughty spirit. All right. Goes
Destruction,
before.
Destruction, stumbling.
All right, we'll just do that one in blue. And then we have the same word here, before. And then
Stumbling.
we have destruction in parallel with, I'll do it
Stumbling.
in red, stumbling, right? That's a very clear parallel statement. He's basically saying the same thing twice, but he's using other synonyms for emphasis to reiterate, okay? So that one's pretty straightforward. The second one's pretty straightforward as well. You tell me, what's the next? The opposite of synonymous. Contrastive, right?
Contrastive.
And notice here, we have an example. The house of the wicked. Okay, there's my subject. It's the same. The tent of the upright. Okay, will be destroyed. But notice, will flourish. Okay, that's the opposite. Okay, to will be destroyed. And then we also have over here
But
the word but. Okay, so notice the parallel nature here: house of the wicked, tent of the upright. And then will be destroyed, will flourish. Both of those are opposite to each other. So this is a contrastive parallelism. The author intentionally is contrasting 2 things, and he's doing it in a similar way. Okay, now not every contrastive passage will have a but in it. Notice Proverbs 10:16. The wages of the righteous. Okay, and what's that compared to? Income of the wicked. And he says, here is life,
punishment.
but here is not life, is, he says punishment here. But notice there's no but in this verse. But this is still contrastive. It doesn't have to have a but. All right? Many times it will, but it doesn't always. So I'm just pointing that out to you, okay? But notice again, opposites being compared. Wages of the righteous, income of the wicked. Is life, is punishment. Okay? All right, so those two are generally fairly easy to spot. The third one is a little bit more of a challenge. Okay, what's the third one?
Developmental.
Developmental. Okay,
Developmental.
I know you guys are getting sick of these, but it's important. You have a good handle on them. Developmental.
No, we're enjoying Pacific.
Okay, good. All right, you get an A for this week. Okay, so Brother Narelle, can you tell me what is one type of developmental parallelism? Remember, there are 3 different kinds.
Yes. Expands or adds.
Very good. So we have expands or adds. So the second one line expands on the other or adds something to the other. So here's an example. The heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy. Now notice these aren't 2 parallel statements. They're not synonymous, right? Because he doesn't say, and the soul knows its sorrow, right? No, he says something about the heart, and then here he adds more information. What is the it's here being referred to? What does that refer to?
Bitterness.
The it's is referring to
The heart knows its
the heart,
bitterness.
right? So the second line is adding more information to the first.
Yes.
It's expanding. 1, the heart knows its own bitterness, and 2, a second thing about the heart is that a stranger does not share its joy, whatever that means. But here we're just looking at the kind of parallelism. So expansion or addition is the idea. All right, good. Okay, Kent, how about the second type of developmental parallelism? Kent.
Explain or illustrate.
Okay, good. A second type is to explain or illustrate. So explanation, or it could be an illustration. All right, and I have an example of that here. What's the illustration here?
Fine.
The deer pants for the water.
Yeah, because notice his statement is this: the Lord tests hearts. But notice here he gives an illustration of that,
Yes,
right?
fine.
What's the illustration?
Fine.
What the refining pot.
Yeah, he has a picture here of a
Refining.
silver or gold being refined. Okay, and that's kind of an illustration of what God does to the heart. Right? He refines it, and so it actually presents a rich image, doesn't it? Because when you do the refining process for silver, and notice he says furnace is for gold. What does he describe there? How do you refine silver and gold? Pretty hot temperature, right? So it's that same picture. Notice he doesn't say anything like the cloth is for the washboard, or he doesn't describe a simple cleaning process. He actually describes a process where there's heat, so that the dross rises to the top to be refined. So there's some imagery there. When the Lord tests the heart, it's not always an easy test, is it? So this illustration is very helpful in opening up some the idea that the author's trying to make. But notice the illustration here is given first, and then the statement. So sometimes the first line will actually explain or illustrate the second. Okay, so we see that in parallelism. Sometimes the first line is developing the second line, and other times the second line develops the first. So just keep that in mind, okay? And then there's a third type of developmental purpose
Reason.
or reason. Okay, purpose and reason's the same thing, or result. Okay? So, here's an example. Leave the presence of a fool, or this is going to happen.
Consequence.
Consequence. Yeah, that could be another, especially in the Proverbs, consequence. Okay? So in this case, the main statement is the first line, and then the second line tells you what's going to happen if you don't. Okay? You see that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. There's another category. All right, we call this one. Some people call it formal or miscellaneous. I don't even bother. I just say but unknown. Okay. And then last but not least, there's a type of called chiasm. And chiasms are usually synonymous, sometimes contrastive. Here's a very well-known example where we can see the second line. Let me shrink this down a little bit. Again, the second line, this is line 1 is be gracious to me. All right, and then line 2 is it's reversed. According to your loving kindness. And again, the focus of a chiasm is the center 2 lines. That's being emphasized. So whenever you see a chiasm, he's not just doing this for creativeness. He's actually doing this because he wants attention to be given to the phrase that he flips in the second line. Okay? So this is important because again, we're always looking for ways that the author is expressing emphasis in his poem, because that we need to express when we preach it. All right? So Brother Rex, when you're pounding that pulpit and you're preaching loud, make sure, that's wonderful to do, and especially in these poems. And we just have to make sure when we do that, the emphasis, we're giving the same emphasis as the author is giving. And so a chiasm is one clue toward that end. All right? I know you love to preach, brother. All right? Now, let's do, what I want to do now is go around, and I'll just call on you, and I want you to identify the type of parallelism. I grabbed a bunch of passages from Proverbs, and just want to see if you can identify the type of parallelism from that passage. All right, so we're going to start with Proverbs 10, verse 12, and I'll just start up with Charlie. If you could type in, what type of parallelism do we see there?
You do it in sign language, Brother Charlie.
He types slow. He's doing the one finger method.
Sign language.
You got it? Hatred stirs up strife. Love covers all transgressions. What kind of parallelism is here? I can't see it.
Not showing up on the chat.
Not showing up.
Oh.
I think he knows. It's
Through Messenger.
Is it Charlie, synonymous or contrastive?
Contrastive.
I think it's saying contrastive.
Yeah. I'm reading his lips. Contrastive. Notice in this proverb, notice the subject, hatred versus
Love.
See that? So we have hatred, love, and then we have hatred stirs, up strife. Love covers all transgressions. So that's a contrasting statement about hatred and love. And then, of course, we have the word but. That helps us out, too. All right? Contrastive. Okay, good. Brother Junie, how about Proverbs 11 here, 29?
He who troubles his own house will inherit wind, and the foolish will be servant to the wise-hearted. That's developmental
Okay,
and expands or adds.
okay, good.
Okay.
You see that? Which line is adding to which line?
Line 2.
Line 2 is
Line
adding
1.
to line 1. See that? He who troubles his own house will inherit the wind, and the foolish will be servant to the wise-hearted. Okay? All right, good. Let's see. Brother Rex, Pastor Rex, Proverbs 13.
The one who guards his mouth preserves his life. The one who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. The same expand.
Contrastive.
Contrastive.
Okay, so you're saying, Pastor Rex, developmental expands?
Yes.
And then I heard some others saying contrastive.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at this. The one who guards his mouth. All right? Do we see a parallel idea in the second line?
Yeah.
Open
Yeah,
wide.
The one who open wide is okay.
Okay, yeah, I can see it.
Okay, and let's look. Preserves
Ruin.
his life. Do we see
Yeah.
okay?
Comes to ruin.
Okay, so here's an example. Those are opposites, right? Now there's no word but between them,
Yeah.
but this is contrastive. Okay?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I see it now.
Okay, good. Well, that's why we're doing these, just to
Mm-hmm.
get some practice. Okay. Proverbs 14:1. Brother Jess.
The wise woman builds her house, but contrastive. But the foolish
Contrastive?
tears it down. Yeah, contrastive.
Yeah, notice. Okay, we have wise woman.
Foolish.
The foolish woman implied. Builds.
Foolish woman. Tears
Okay.
build.
And here we have tears down. And then her house. Okay. And then it. It's kind of buried in the middle there. Yeah, these are exactly parallel contrastive. All right. Proverbs are full of contrastive ones. Okay. All right. Proverbs 14. Let's see. Ramel, can you do that one? Now I'm going to give you a hint. Just because the word but is here, don't let that fool you into. What do you say? Developmental? What kind? Addition? Is that what you had? Okay. Let's look at this. There is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Notice this, its end. Yeah, I think the idea is a result or a consequence, as someone said. Okay? Because he's talking about what will happen when a man goes that way that seems right. Okay? All right. Let's go to the next one. Kenneth?
Even in laughter, the heart may be in pain, and the end of joy may be grief.
Sounds a little tougher.
It's a contrastive.
Okay. Let's see. The laughter, or the heart, sorry. You're saying the end of joy? Is that what you're comparing?
Yeah.
Maybe in pain. So maybe.
It's synonymous.
Yeah, I think it's synonymous. Okay. Oops. Sometimes it's helpful to do this. You know, you can
Yeah,
use
but I'm not
highlighting
sure
or,
the word.
yeah, I think it's synonymous.
Mm.
Sometimes if you take a pen or something and circle like the subjects and underline the verbs and put a square around the objects, you can see the, yeah, so that's how I work it through. You guys see that? Synonymous? This one's a little tougher. That word and could trick us a little bit into thinking it's developmental addition, right?
Yeah, it seems.
But don't always assume that. Just like don't assume if the word but is there. Remember, we just saw in this one the word but it was developmental. It wasn't contrastive. And then up here we saw no but it was contrastive. All right,
Yeah.
so just keep that in mind. Okay, where are we? Eric, can you do the next proverb?
Tempered man acts foolishly, and a man of evil devices is hated. Same, synonymous.
Okay,
It's
synonymous.
developmental.
Okay, let's look. Quick-tempered man, man of evil devices. Okay, acts.
Developmental
It's developmental.
Yeah, I think so. Why is that?
Addition.
It's hated.
It's not synonymous.
Developmental and what kind?
Addition.
Adds.
Yeah, it seems to be adding something to it, right? At first glance, synonymous is a good guess. But notice it says acts foolishly versus is hated. If it had said a man of evil devices does wrong, that would be synonymous. Okay? Because if he had said this, a man of evil devices behaves wrongly
Wickedly.
or wickedly, yeah, that would be, this would be synonymous. But notice he makes a statement about the man. The man is hated. So he's really adding more information rather than restating the first line. Okay, synonymous is just this. It's a restatement of the first line using a different words. Okay, developmental is where this, in this case, the second line is adding more information to the first. So it's telling us more about the quick-tempered man. Okay. Again, a little bit tricky here, so that was not an easy one. Okay, let me ask your buddy Eric to do the next one. The silent partner. Proverbs 14:19.
Wait, tampangay.
You're muted.
How that before the good and the wicked at the gates of the righteous.
Oh, there's an illusion.
I think
Synonymous.
synonymous.
Synonymous? Okay, well, let's take a look at it. The evil.
The wicked.
The wicked.
All right. The wicked. Now,
there's
there's a little trick here. We'll bow down.
Illusion.
But notice it's not in the second line. What happened here?
It's omitted.
It's implied though, right?
Yeah.
The wicked will what at the gates of the righteous? Well, here, this is what we're going to discuss this a lot more next week, but this is called elision. It's a poetic device where part of the line is removed but assumed to be there. Remember, and we see this a lot in poetry just for style. Okay, If he had said the evil will bow down and the wicked will bow down, that's kind of repetitive or redundant. It doesn't sound as doesn't flow well. So sometimes the poet will take it out. So if we notice that here, then we have before the good and at the gates of the righteous. Okay, notice good and righteous, those are parallel ideas, correct?
Mm.
Okay, so this is synonymous. But the tricky part here was this fact that the will bow down was left out of the second line. So that made it a little bit tougher to figure out. Okay, very good, very good. Okay, Joshua, Proverbs 16:3.
Developmental.
Okay, developmental. How? What kind of
Add.
development?
It's result. It's a result.
Okay, I hear
Result.
result. I hear addition.
Results.
Okay, let's look at this. Commit your works to the Lord, and then again, may or may not be helpful, and your plans will be established. Yeah, that sounds like a result, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you do the first line, so line 2 gives the result if you do line 1. See that?
Yeah.
So it's almost like there's an if here. All right, it's not there, it's not in the Hebrew, but that's the idea. Do this, and this is the result. Okay? All right, Brother Norel, can you take care of the next verse there? Proverbs 16:4.
16:4. I think developmental.
Okay. You said developmental. How?
Developmental purpose or result.
Okay, purpose or result. So which line is the purpose of the other of which line?
The Lord has made everything for his own purpose, even the wicked for the day of evil.
It's adds. It's
addition.
Okay.
Okay. So I hear adds. How about this?
Illustrate.
Yes. I think it's an illustration. Line 2 is an illustration
of line 1.
Of line 1. The statement is the Lord has made everything for its own purpose, and then an illustration of that is he's made the wicked for a day of evil, or a specific example.
Okay.
Okay, this again is not easy. Okay? I think that's the best. We know for sure it's developmental. All right? So all we're trying to figure out is how does it develop it. Now, let me stop here a minute, guys. We're going through these exercises. We have to always remind ourselves how can this be helpful to us as we're studying poetry? How can parallelism be a helpful tool for us to examine in a poem? Got any ideas?
First, to see the emphasis of the author.
Okay, good. Can help us see emphasis.
And secondly is to see the line of thinking, what really is the flow of the thoughts of the author.
Yeah, we're trying to, it's really interpretive, isn't it? We're trying to understand what is the connection between the lines. And that's really because we understand an element of Hebrew poetry is parallelism. So we understand that very often the poet will intentionally be connecting these two lines together in some way. Okay, that's the assumption. And so by doing this process, what we're doing is trying to figure out what is that connection. And in a lot of ways, it's like block diagramming or structural diagramming. Structural diagramming also examines the relationship between phrases. Okay, parallelism examines the relationships between lines. Okay, so what this is doing is it's forcing us to now start thinking about, okay, we know that the author has intentionally connected these two lines in some way. Okay, that's the characteristic of Hebrew poetry. Now we're just trying to go, okay, how is he connecting them? And that process of thinking about that, trying to answer that question, helps us get insight into the poem. We're just trying to basically interpret. You know, this is part of the interpretive process. But the thing that it helps us is knowing that parallelism is being used. Now, when we go outside the Psalms or the Proverbs, parallelism is not commonly used. Like among the prophets, they'll use it sometimes, but not often. Parallelism is primarily within the Psalms, Proverbs, and then it's used at times in other poetic writings. Okay, so all poetic writings express imagery and figurative language. Okay, but not all poetic writings express parallelism. Okay, but if you're in the Psalms or the Proverbs, it's very, very common. Okay. All right. Any questions on that? So again, this is a step that's helping us in interpreting, because again, we know that the author is likely intentionally connecting these lines in some way. All right. Any questions?
None so
You
far.
guys are still with me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't see anyone napping, except Brother Patrick, Brother Vikmar. I don't know what they're doing. They turned off the video. Okay. All right, let's keep going. Where did we leave off? I think, Brother Jason, you were next. Proverbs 16:18.
Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before unanimous.
Yeah, you got an easy one. All right. I should make you do the next one because it's so easy. Right? Pride, haughty spirit, clearly together, goes before. All right, and that's parallel to. All right, and then destruction is synonymous with stumbling. Okay. Now, another advantage of parallelism is that it can help us understand. It can help us understand specific words. So here, for example, in here we see destruction and stumbling. Solomon here, writing this proverb, makes a direct connection between those two. They're synonymous in some way. They're connected in some way. And so by having those two words together, if we did a word study, we could look for how do these words overlap, and that can help us understand the point he's trying to make. Because we know there's parallelism being used here, and so we know that these two words have a connection. Pride and a haughty spirit. Okay, those are connected together. All right? So parallelism can also help us understand what is meant by specific words, and that's very helpful for Proverbs, right? Because Proverbs, there's not a context usually. A lot of these are just 2 or 3 line statements that can be very hard to interpret at times. So knowing there's parallelism involved can help us in understanding the words that are being used. Okay. All right. So Pastor Jason, we're going to give you another one because the last one was so easy. All right. Proverbs 17:14.
The beginning of strife is like getting out of water, so abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. But developmental.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're right there. What kind?
Names or illustration?
Purpose.
Illustrates.
Names or
Purpose.
Okay, I'm here illustration. I hear purpose.
Because of the word so.
It's more of illustration.
Okay, notice this word.
So.
He's making the statement, abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. Why?
Because he's illustrating the water.
The
Okay.
beginning of life.
Giving us the picture of a water letting up.
So,
Okay.
give reason or purpose why you should
Reason.
yeah.
I think that's what it is. Now, it could be, as Brother Kenneth is mentioning, he's saying line 1 is illustration. Is that correct? Is that what you're saying, Kenneth?
Yes.
Yeah. It could be. I mean, there's this picture here of letting out water, but I think the idea of this word so, in this case, might be directing us a little more to the fact that there's a purpose here. Okay? The statement is, abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. Why? Because if you don't, strife is like letting out water, which is a metaphor. But I would lean towards this one myself.
Pastor Charlie is saying maybe it's reason.
Or reason, yeah.
Reason is reason. Purpose or reason is reason.
Yeah, purpose, reason.
Reason.
Yeah.
The same.
Same idea. Yes, our silent scholar, I think, is correct.
From the now city.
Okay, very good. Very good. Okay, let's do a couple more, and then we'll dive into Psalm 99, see how far we get. Kent, have you done one already?
Yes.
Okay, Brother Edwin, can you do the next one here? Proverbs
A
7.
man lacking in sense of pledges and becomes guarantor in the presence of his neighbor.
Someone lacking in sin.
Developmental.
What do we see going on here?
Developmental result.
Developmental, I think.
I would agree.
Result.
Yes.
Result.
Yeah, line 2 is the result of line 1.
Okay. Or I heard addition. So let's look at this. A man lacking in sense pledges. And notice it doesn't say a fool who is, or a man who is foolish, but it's not, so it's not synonymous here. He's adding something, and the word and helps us a little bit. So it's developmental, and it could be adding more information, or it could be telling us what will happen. And I think, so a man lacking in sense pledges. What happens? He becomes a guarantor. Okay, so yeah, maybe result might be a good, because of that word becomes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I would agree with that. Let's see. Okay. All right. Who has not? All right, Brother Vikmar, are you on? Are you listening?
Yes,
Are you there, Vikmar?
listening.
Can you do the next one if you hear me?
Who's still awake?
Is there snoring?
Pastor Tim.
Yes.
Just said.
Patrick, are you there?
Oh, he has no audio device, I think.
Oh, okay. Let me see. Is he on the chat?
Yeah, he answered already. Parallelism.
Okay. Parallelism. What kind, Vikmar?
Of course.
Is it?
Okay,
Vikmar says synonymous. Okay, let's take a look. See if he's right.
Hello guys, I already ran out of load. Oh, excuse me.
Uh-oh, he ran out of load.
It's more of like
okay.
Developmental illustrates.
Developmental and addition.
Okay, we have synonymous is one of the possibilities. Synonymous. Developmental. What was it? Developmental what?
Addition.
Addition? Okay,
Mm,
let's
addition.
look. A foolish son is a grief. So we have a foolish son. And then we have is a grief. So let's just break up the sentence here. To his father. All right.
Developmental.
Now bitterness. Okay.
Bitterness
Notice.
is a grief, illusion.
Oh,
Yes,
yes.
Yeah, the poet tricked us here. Okay. Notice a foolish son was left out of the second line. I think anonymous is the correct answer. All right. Good job, Vikmar. You proved that you were awake. All right. Yeah, I think here it's another example of elision. See that? Okay, yeah, this poetic device called elision will pop up quite often. Okay, so I think this is the synonymous is the most accurate. And again, I did that because this is why I do this. I break up the subject, verb, and object just to see. Okay, well, I see a verb here is bitter, or the bitterness, and then to her who bore him. So it looks parallel to synonymous to me. And if we assume there's elision here, that a foolish son was left out, then it's clearly synonymous. Okay. All right. A little trick there. Okay, we got one left. Let's see, Patrick, are you there?
He's sleeping already.
He was there a while ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll do this one since I'm a nice professor. All right. Let's do Proverbs 19:8. I think
He answered.
pretty.
Gave an answer.
Oh, he did? I didn't
Yes.
have my chat open. What did he say?
Anonymous.
Yeah. Good job.
Synonymous.
Synonymous. Notice, let's he who gets wisdom, he who keeps understanding. Okay? Loves.
Find it.
Will find. Okay, loves his own soul. All right. So synonymous looks to be the answer here. All right. It could be developmental addition, but again, I think we can see synonymous there. Okay. All right. So we went through a number of these just to give you, and we saw very different kinds. Let's go back to our poetic analysis and remind ourselves of the steps. First, read and observe. Second, identify the setting of the poem and its structure. And by structure, I mean the stanzas. And then the third is to examine the parallelism. Okay, so we talked about parallelism. We looked at several examples. Let's do this. We'll just start this week looking at Psalm 99, and we'll finish up next week. Okay, since it's already 11:40. But let's review first parallelism. What are the steps? And essentially there are three steps for parallelism analysis. Okay, the first step is identify how many lines are in the verse. Okay, because sometimes we can have a bicola. Okay, who remembers what that means? You can have a verse that's a bicola.
2 lines.
2 lines.
2 lines.
2 cokes. Nope. Okay. 2 lines. That's right.
One is really heavy.
Sounds like Siri.
Siri. Okay, tricola. What's a verse that's in tricola?
3 lines.
3
Coca-Cola.
And then we could have more than that. Yeah. Or there's, Coca-Cola. All right. Okay. So first we want to identify that, because if there's more than 2 lines, we could have multiple parallelism going on, like line 1 and line 2, or line 2 and line 3. Or sometimes you can have lines 2 and 3 be parallel to line 1 in some way. All right, so it gets a little more complicated when we go beyond 2 lines in a verse, and we're going to see that in Psalm 99. Okay. All right, now the second, so first identify how many lines are in the verse, and then secondly, identify the type of parallelism between the lines within each verse. Okay, we just did that for a number of examples above, and all the examples, by the way, we looked at on the Proverbs here. How many lines are in each of these Proverbs?
It's a bicola.
They're all bicola.
2.
Okay, that's very common in Proverbs from chapters 10 through 29. They're what we think of a proverbial statement, 2 lines. Okay, but when we go to the Psalms, we will see that many Psalms have verses with 2 lines or 3 lines, and some have 4 or even 5 lines. All right. All right, so let's go back here, and then what we want to do after we've identified the parallelism between each line, we then want to essentially summarize parallelism used in the poem. Okay, and we're looking for, are there any patterns? Okay, is there a dominant type of parallelism? Okay, for example, in Psalm 51, David uses chiasms a lot through much of the poem. That's something to pay attention to. Why does he do that? If he uses chiasms a lot, remember, what does a chiasm do? It helps show us emphasis. So if we have a poem that uses a lot of chiasm, that's telling us there's a lot of emotion in this poem. There's a lot of emphasis going on. So it's important to see. In some poems, we'll see a bunch of synonymous parallelism used, and then one verse uses developmental. Sometimes the author will do that because he's wanting to draw attention to that verse that is different as far as parallelism is concerned. Okay, so it's helpful at the end, after you look at the parallelism used, see if there's any patterns. There's not always patterns, but sometimes there are. So we just want to pay attention to that. Okay. All right. Any questions?
None.
We're okay. All right. Let's do this. Let's just for this week, we'll identify the. Now we'll look to Psalm 99 this week. Just take another 5 minutes or so. We'll identify the number of lines in each verse, and then next week when we pick up together, we'll go through and identify the parallelism used in each verse. Okay. So let me just take a few more minutes. And so the first step, again, is to identify how many lines are contained within each verse. Now, let me mention something here. Let me wait. I'll just show by example. Okay, so first step in parallelism analysis. Identify how many lines in each verse. Okay, so let's just quickly go through. And I'm using the New American Standard as my reference translation here. Okay, just keep that in mind. So when we identify the number of lines, part of that process is interpretive, so the translations are sometimes a little different here. Okay, so verse 1, we'll pick up with Charlie here. How many lines are in verse 1? You can just hold up your hand. 2, right? Yeah, pretty straightforward. 2 lines. Okay. Pastor June, how many lines in verse 2?
2.
Yep, pretty straightforward. Brother, Pastor Rex?
2.
Dalawa?
3.
Yeah, 2 lines. Now, okay, so far 2 lines, 2 lines. Okay, we hit verse 4.
3
Brother
lines.
Jess, we have how many? 3.
3 lines.
Now, that's the New American Standard. If we were to be using, Brother Jess, I believe you have an ESV Bible, right? How many lines do you see in the ESV version?
2. Sorry. Okay. Moment.
4 lines.
4.
Yeah, the ESV has 4 lines.
Yes.
Okay. So
Yeah,
we
4
go,
lines.
so why are they different? Is it 3 lines or 4 lines? What is the original author? What did he intend? For there to be 3 or 4? We could look at the New King James, and it tells us we have 3 lines.
3 lines.
Okay, so how do we figure out whether it's 3 or 4?
Cut it at the original text.
Yeah, if we were Hebrew scholars, we could go back and look at the Hebrew, and there are accents that are written in the original Hebrew text that indicate where the lines should be broken up. But because we're not Hebrew scholars, most of us anyway. I know Kenneth, he knows Hebrew really well, but he's hiding that fact from us. You're gonna just have to trust your translation. Okay, for the most part, the translations are accurate here. I think in this particular verse, when I look back at the Hebrew, and maybe next week I'll show you an example of this. I'll have a picture for you. But I believe 3 lines is the accurate expression here. It should be 3 lines. But as I mentioned, for the most part, the translations, at least the New American Standard, the ESV, and the New King James are the best ones to use for this exercise, and they will usually agree. If not, what I do is just look at, okay, is there, which translations, of those 3 translations, which ones agree? And in this case, the New American Standard and the New King James agree, and so we're going to go with that. Okay? If you don't have access to Hebrew and all of that, don't worry about it. The translations usually are going to be fine. Okay? Once in a while, like here in this case, in this poem, we had 1 verse that was a little different. But if we can consult the New King James, the ESV, and the New American Standard, I would just go with which 2 of those agree. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So in that case, we go with the New American Standard because it agrees with the New King James. It has 3 lines. All right. William, Brother William, how many lines in verse 5?
I see 3 here.
Yep, 3 lines, and that's an agreement in all the translations. Okay, Eric, how many lines?
Verse 6 has 3 lines also. 3 lines.
And we're going to see that.
Okay.
3 lines on verse 7. 3 lines for verse 8. Okay. So basically, this poem, if we look at, if we go back here, the first 3 verses are 2 lines.
2 lines.
And then the rest of the poem is 3 lines, 3 lines, 3 lines. Okay? So I might just write myself a quick summary. The first 3 verses are 2 lines, and that's bicola. And the last 6 verses are 3 lines, tricola. Now, we might ask ourselves, is that intentional by the author? Is he trying to show us something by that difference. Maybe, maybe not. We'll have to study the poem more to determine that. But sometimes the author will change the number of lines on purpose to make a point. Okay? Just keep that in mind. So for example, you may have a poem that's all 2 lines and then one verse in the poem is 3 lines. You may have done that on purpose. Okay? So keep that in mind. Now here we have 3 verses that are 2 lines and 6 verses that are 3 lines. Whether that's intentional or not, let's keep going in our analysis of this poem. But one thing to keep in mind, if the stanzas we identified are correct, and if you remember, the stanzas are verses 1 to 3, verses 4 to 5, verses 6 to 9.
6 to 9.
Notice verses 1 to 3, all of these are 2 lines. Okay, and then the others are 3 lines. Okay, that might be an intentional pattern. Okay, just pointing that out. All right. Okay.
Pastor Tim.
Yes.
In an iPad, we cannot see really how many lines are there.
Oh yes. Okay. Yeah.
Confused.
The electronic versions will not show the lines very well. Yeah.
You have to choose a particular Bible app.
Yeah, and even the Bible apps, they may just have the text, but they don't show the lines. This is a weakness in the software because they really should show the lines because that's part of the interpretive process of the poem. So they're actually causing part of the way you would interpret the poem. They're actually causing that to be blurred. What I would recommend is using a hard copy Bible for this step. All right.
Pastor Rex, if you use the Bible Gateway app, even on an Apple device, it breaks down as in print.
Oh, correct.
Bible Gateway does?
Yeah, I think Bible, yeah.
Same way as the hard copy?
Yeah, same as the hard copy.
Okay. Good.
You can also use Windows app. If your device is Windows, there's a lot of Windows app.
Or you can also try the Olive Tree ESP app. It also reflects just like the print.
You would using with the smaller devices?
Yeah, try the Olive Tree ESP app. It also is similar to the one printed.
Thanks, William. Yeah, that's a very important point to keep in mind. So I would recommend if you use a hard copy, because all the hard copies translations, the printed form will show the lines, but that's not always the case for electronic versions. So if you have a hard copy, that's the best to use for this, if you can.
Pastor Tim,
Yes.
I just observing here, the lines are segregated, but it was not segregated by the period back. Is it really intentional for the printer?
I didn't hear the full question. There's some background
really
noise.
print that way, the original text?
Is there a difference what?
Yeah. In the original text, original manuscript, is it really lined in three lines?
Yes.
3 lines and 2 lines are like that?
Yeah. I'll show you next week. Let me write a note to show. I'll show you the Hebrew text, and I'll show you in the Hebrew text there are marks that show the break in the lines. Okay. They're called Hebrew accents. They're called disjunctive. Here, I'll type it out. For those of you that want to look like Hebrew scholars to your congregations, you could say there are disjunctive Hebrew accents. Okay. All right, there you go. So this is you can sound really smart, but basically there are like small marks on the text that are indicators of division of the line. So I'll show you an example next week. And there are many Hebrew accents. Okay, great question. Great question. Okay, so for this week, guys, I would like you to try to go through Psalm 99, just see if you can identify the parallelism. So for this week, identify parallelism used for each verse in Psalm 99. Okay. And we'll go through that together. And then next week, we will begin to take a look at the poetic devices, the figurative language, imagery, and stuff like that. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Any final questions? All right. Pastor Jason, would you mind closing us in prayer?
Yes, Pastor Steve.
Thank you.
Let's all pray. Lord, we thank you, Lord, for guiding us, Lord, giving us understanding and wisdom past 2 hours. Lord, to Dr. Team for continuously, Lord, strengthening him. We appreciate, Lord, his sincerity and effort and concern for us to be continuously equipped, especially in spite of this crisis. We thank you for him, his life. We pray for him. We continue, Lord of God, bless his life, Lord, that will multiply over us. We thank you. We pray over each of every one of us, Lord, wherever we are. Would you continually, Lord, protect us and preserve us, and also, Lord, we continually, Lord, bless the ministries that we're doing in the midst of this crisis. We thank you for everything today. In Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, brothers. It's great to see you
Thank you,
all.
Pastor Tim.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Pastor Tim.
Have a blessed
Thank
week.
you very much. Thank you.
All right.
Pastor
Thank
Tim.
you.
Next
bless
See you
Friday.
next week.
God bless.
Next Friday, same time, brothers. Love you guys.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you later.
Pastor.
Have a good
Thank
night.
you, Pastor
Have a
Tim.
good night.